Tonight, we uncover a story the Vatican hoped would never be told. A story buried not in myth, but in sand. A book so ancient, so defiant, that it dared to teach what no empire wanted mankind to remember. They called it the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but that was never its real name. To those who wrote it, it was the book of coming forth by day, a guide not for the dead, but for the living, a map of the soul that promised freedom without permission, truth without confession, and eternal life without the church. And that made it dangerous, because long before Rome built its cathedrals, Egypt had already written the blueprint for salvation, a civilization that measured eternity in light and balance, not in guilt or sin. Their book spoke of judgment by truth, not by priest, of resurrection through self-knowledge, not by faith alone. It gave humanity something no institution could sell, the power to save itself. When early Christian scholars found its fragments, they saw the resemblance and the risk. The feather of Ma'at against the heart, the weighing of truth, the promise that every soul was its own judge. They saw ideas older than Genesis and holier than the church would ever admit. So the orders came quietly. The texts were catalogued, then removed. Translations were smoothed until meaning disappeared. Egypt was to be praised for its beauty, not believed for its wisdom. The book that once guided kings to eternity became a heresy hidden under centuries of silence. But not everything stayed buried. Beneath monasteries, in forgotten libraries, in the sand itself, the echoes survived. In the Renaissance, in secret studies, in the margins of forbidden scrolls, the words kept returning, whispering the same truth the Vatican could not erase. That salvation was never owned. It was understood. So tonight, we open the vault they sealed. We follow the trail from the Nile to the Tiber, from tomb walls to cathedral halls, from the first prayers of the dead to the confessions of the living. Because what the Vatican feared was not a curse, but a revelation, a book that proved that knowledge, not obedience, leads to eternity. The church may have erased its name, but its light still burns beneath the dust, and if you listen closely, you can still hear it speak, reminding us that the dead were never silent. It was the living who were told not to listen. Long before the first cathedral stone was laid, before the first cross was lifted to the sky, there were words carved in the silence of sand. They told of a path no priest could grant, a journey of light and judgment that began not in heaven but in the heart. Those who first heard of it called it a book of the dead, but the truth, hidden in its papyrus lines, was far more alive than anything written since. They said it could guide a soul through the dark. They said it could teach a mortal to walk beside gods. That rumour, quiet as dust on the wind, reached the ears of men who feared nothing more than freedom dressed as knowledge. Somewhere along the Nile, between broken tombs and the last whisper of sunset, a scribe pressed a reed into wet clay and copied words forbidden to fade. It was not a prayer, it was instruction. How to remember one's name, how to speak truth before the scales of Ma'at, how to pass through the gates without permission. That was the danger. A book that made no use for priests, no need for confession, no hunger for forgiveness. When word of it crossed to Rome centuries later, it was not carried by merchants, but by ghosts of ideas, drifting through Greek scholars, tucked into margins of philosophy, wrapped in mystery. To the church that rose from ashes of empires, such a text was poison. If the dead could find eternity without them, what power would the living have to offer? In marble halls, where light bent through coloured glass, a whisper began to grow. They spoke of a heresy older than Christ, older than Moses, older than every story used to keep men silent. The Egyptian Book of the Dead was not a tale of superstition. It was a map, and maps lead somewhere. The Vatican understood that to control heaven, one must also control the directions that lead there. They buried the rumour beneath layers of doctrine. They renamed gods, redrew symbols, called them demons, and burned the papyri that could not be translated into obedience. Yet, no matter how deep they buried it, the sand always remembers. In the still air of forgotten tombs, the voices still echo. Words that once promised liberation still cling to stone, waiting for eyes brave enough to see. They tell of judgment not from an altar, but from within. They tell of a scale that measures not belief, but truth. And so began a war not of armies, but of memory, between those who worship light and those who wish to own it. The whisper of the sand never stopped. It waited for centuries, for a world distracted enough to forget and curious enough to rediscover. What the Vatican tried to erase was never dead. It was only sleeping, under 1,000 years of dust, waiting for someone to listen. They tried to burn it, drown it, and bury it beneath the weight of empires, but the words would not die. The Egyptian book of coming forth by day was more than ink on papyrus. It was memory-given voice, soul-given language. It survived because it was not just written, it was believed. Every copy, every carving, every whispered recitation was an act of defiance against oblivion. The priests of old Memphis and Thebes knew the desert could swallow bodies, but never the truth carved into its bones. They etched the sacred verses deep into tomb walls, so that even when papyrus rotted and temples fell, the knowledge would stand in stone, facing eternity. When the Nile rose in flood, washing away villages and fields, fragments of the book drifted among the reeds, like ghosts returning to shore. When conquerors from Persia, Greece, and Rome marched through Egypt, they found these words staring back at them from the faces of the dead. They took statues, gold, and grain, but the book followed them home, hidden in scrolls and copied by curious hands who only half understood what they carried. Scholars called it magic. Warriors called it blasphemy. But the words kept travelling. By the time Alexandria's library burned, countless private collections held copies, partial or complete, enough for the text to survive the ashes. Even when the language itself was lost, the images remained, painted in tombs and temples, waiting for a century that would remember how to read them again. Some say the book lived because it had to. It carried a promise that death was not the end, that the soul could stand before its own truth and still walk forward. Empires rise on the fear of endings. The book of coming forth by day erased that fear. To rulers and priests who thrived on obedience, that was a threat more dangerous than any army. Yet, for the common people, it was hope. A farmer who buried a loved one could carve a single line from the book and believe that their spirit would find its way home. A scribe could risk punishment just to copy one more verse before nightfall. In every age, someone kept it alive. Through conquest, plague, and translation, the book changed names, forms, and languages, but not its purpose. It refused to vanish because it spoke to something deeper than any religion could replace. It reminded humanity that divinity was not distant, it was within. And even as new powers rose and declared the old gods dead, the words remained patient, buried under sand, beneath stone, behind locked doors in the vaults of history, still whispering. They waited for the day when truth could walk freely again, when the book would no longer need to hide to be heard. They tried to burn it, drown it, and bury it beneath the weight of empires, but the words would not die. The Egyptian book of coming forth by day was more than ink on papyrus. It was memory given voice, soul given language. It survived because it was not just written, it was believed. Every copy, every carving, every whispered recitation was an act of defiance against oblivion. The priests of old Memphis and Thebes knew the desert could swallow bodies, but never the truth carved into its bones. They etched the sacred verses deep into tomb walls, so that even when papyrus rotted and temples fell, the knowledge would stand in stone, facing eternity. When the Nile rose in flood, washing away villages and fields, fragments of the book drifted among the reeds, like ghosts returning to shore. When conquerors from Persia, Greece, and Rome marched through Egypt, they found these words staring back at them from the faces of the dead. They took statues, gold, and grain, but the book followed them home, hidden in scrolls and copied by curious hands who only half understood what they carried. Scholars called it magic. Warriors called it blasphemy. But the words kept travelling. By the time Alexandria's library burned, countless private collections held copies, partial or complete, enough for the text to survive the ashes. Even when the language itself was lost, the images remained, painted in tombs and temples, waiting for a century that would remember how to read them again. Some say the book lived because it had to. It carried a promise that death was not the end, that the soul could stand before its own truth and still walk forward. Empires rise on the fear of endings. The book of coming forth by day erased that fear. To rulers and priests who thrived on obedience, that was a threat more dangerous than any army. Yet, for the common people, it was hope. A farmer who buried a loved one could carve a single line from the book and believe that their spirit would find its way home. A scribe could risk punishment just to copy one more verse before nightfall. In every age, someone kept it alive. Through conquest, plague, and translation, the book changed names, forms, and languages, but not its purpose. It refused to vanish because it spoke to something deeper than any religion could replace. It reminded humanity that divinity was not distant. It was within. And even as new powers rose and declared the old gods dead, the words remained patient, buried under sand, beneath stone, behind locked doors in the vaults of history, still whispering. They waited for the day when truth could walk freely again, when the book would no longer need to hide to be heard. When Rome first heard the echo of Egyptian afterlife lore, it was not through temples or tombs, but through the pages of Greek translators and the stories of wandering travellers. These early Christians, hungry to understand the mysteries of the world they sought to convert, began reading fragments of something unsettling. The book of coming forth by day spoke of a soul judged not by church, not by ritual, but by truth alone. It described a divine order balanced by Mart, where the heart of a man weighed against a feather determined his eternity. To the scholars of Rome, this was both fascinating and terrifying. They found in those lines a system older than Genesis, more intricate than Revelation, and hauntingly close to what they preached as their own. The Egyptian priests had described resurrection long before the Gospels were written, had promised eternal life through purity of word and deed long before any baptism. The realization rippled quietly through monasteries and study halls. If these truths had existed before Christ, then what did that mean for the church built on the claim of new revelation? Some sought to reconcile it, calling Egypt a land of shadows and prophecy, where pagans had glimpsed what would later be fulfilled in Christian truth. Others feared it was proof that the foundations of their faith were borrowed. A few whispered that the Egyptians had known too much. The text spoke of light emerging from darkness, of the soul travelling through gates guarded by divine words, of the name holding power greater than any title. To men who believed salvation could only come through the church, this was a dangerous mirror. The Greeks had already softened the imagery, turning spells into hymns, gods into metaphors, and rituals into philosophy. But even in translation, the heart of it remained alive. A truth that humans could reach divinity through knowledge and moral balance, without mediation, without permission. The more they read, the less control they felt. In Alexandria, where faith and reason once met, Christian theologians debated whether to preserve or destroy these fragments. Some kept copies under false names, disguising them as studies of ancient superstition. Others quoted the texts in secret sermons, perhaps not realizing their source. The Vatican would later trace those echoes in early manuscripts and realize the depth of contamination. The Church feared not the words themselves, but the independence they inspired. To learn that salvation was a matter of balance, not belonging, was to break the need for authority. And so, the notes taken in curiosity turned into orders for silence. By the 3rd century, many scholars who once studied the Egyptian rites would be condemned or forgotten, their writings locked away or burned. But even as Rome tried to unhear what it had learned, the whisper of Egypt lingered. In art, in architecture, in ritual, its rhythm survived. The empire learned to listen, but it could never unlearn what it heard. In the desert silence of ancient Egypt, faith was not about belonging to a temple or obeying a priest. It was about standing before the truth and being measured by it. The Egyptian texts taught that every person, from farmer to pharaoh, would one day face the weighing of the heart. No priest could intervene, no offering could change the outcome, no ritual could rewrite the weight of one's actions. The heart itself was the record, and truth was the judge. In this theology, there were no gatekeepers. The path to eternity was personal, earned through integrity, kindness, and balance with the world. This simple but dangerous idea threatened the entire foundation of organized power that came after. It meant that divinity was not hidden behind altars. It lived within every act of honesty, every moment of compassion, every refusal to deceive. To the Egyptians, Maat was more than a goddess. She was the law of the universe, the balance that held stars in their courses and hearts in their peace. Her feather rested on the scales beside each soul. If your heart was heavy with lies, greed, or cruelty, you would be devoured by chaos. But if it was light with truth, you would pass into eternal day. There was no confessional, no priestly pardon, no indulgence to buy. The only price was how you had lived. Centuries later, when Christian scholars uncovered these beliefs, they saw the danger instantly. A theology without gatekeepers was a threat to every system that relied on control. How could the church sell forgiveness if salvation required no permission? How could priests claim to hold the keys of heaven if every soul already carried its own? The Egyptians had built a civilization around moral responsibility rather than blind obedience. Their temples taught harmony with creation, not domination over it. Even the pharaoh, the living god, was judged by Ma'at. No one stood above the law of truth. This was more than religion. It was philosophy, science, and conscience woven together. The Book of Coming Forth by Day was its manual, guiding each person through tests of the soul, not to earn favor, but to prove alignment with cosmic order. When Rome encountered these ideas, they had no place to fit them. A god that judged directly left no room for mediators. So, they reinterpreted the concept, turning inner judgment into external authority, the balance of Ma'at into the weighing of sins by a divine throne. Yet the echo remained. Even in the deepest cathedrals, the idea survived in whispers and symbols, in the scales held by saints and angels. It was the ancient truth the Vatican could never fully erase, the idea that you could walk to the light by your own honesty. In a world built on permission, Egypt had discovered freedom, and that freedom, carried across time, still unsettles those who would rather rule souls than free them. In the halls of judgment beneath the stars, the Egyptians believed that every soul would face the scales of Ma'at. On one side rested a single white feather, the symbol of truth, justice, and universal order. On the other lay the heart of the deceased, heavy or light with the weight of their life. There were no excuses, no witnesses to defend you, no priest to speak in your name. The heart was your testimony. It remembered every kindness, every cruelty, every lie, every truth. When it was placed on the scale, the universe listened. If it balanced with the feather, your spirit passed on to the fields of eternal peace. If it sank under its own burden, it was cast into oblivion, devoured by the beast Amut. This was not punishment by a god's anger. It was consequence, pure and fair. The Egyptians saw it as a cosmic audit, a mirror held up to the soul. You were not measured by belief, but by balance. Salvation was not about what you worshipped, but how you lived. This simple law carried a power that made kings humble and peasants divine. It said that morality was universal, not owned by temples or priests. Even the gods were subject to ma'at, the harmony that kept creation alive. To live in truth was to sustain the world. To live in falsehood was to break it. Every word spoken, every act done, every thought hidden left an imprint. And one day, all would be weighed. When later faiths discovered this idea, they borrowed its symbols but softened its meaning. The scale became a metaphor, the feather a decoration. Judgment became external, a divine court instead of an inner reckoning. But the original message was far more profound. The Egyptians believed that the soul carried its own scale within. You could feel the weight of your heart in life just as surely as in death. A heavy heart was its own punishment. A light heart, its own reward. This was why confession in Egypt meant truth spoken to oneself, not forgiveness granted by another. You balanced your heart by your actions, by living in harmony with Ma'at's principles. The church later feared this concept because it left no need for authority. If every person could find truth within, what use was a hierarchy of salvation? The weighing of the heart reminded humanity that no one could lie their way into eternity. You could not bribe truth or negotiate with it. You could only become it. The image of the feather floating beside the heart was both beautiful and terrifying. It promised that the universe was just, but that justice began with you. In the quiet of a tomb, carved in eternal stone, those scales still wait, reminding every generation that heaven is not a reward to be given. It is a reflection to be earned. In ancient Egypt, to know a name was to hold power. The people believed that every being, mortal or divine, carried a true name, a secret sound that connected their essence to creation itself. A name was not just identification, it was energy, it was sovereignty. When spoken with understanding, it could command spirits, open gates, and protect the soul beyond death. The Book of Coming Forth by Day was filled with these names and spells, not as charms of superstition, but as keys of consciousness. Each verse reminded the traveller through the afterlife who they truly were. It armed them against fear, against forgetfulness, against the illusion of separation from the divine. The soul that remembered its true name could never be enslaved. That was the wisdom that frightened empires. Knowledge as liberation, faith as mastery, not obedience. When the Vatican later examined the remnants of these texts, they found something that defied their entire system of control. Here was a religion that gave every individual the tools to face eternity on their own. The spells were not invocations of gods to save you. They were affirmations of selfhood. They declared, "I am pure, I am light, I am the one who knows the names of the gates and the keepers." In a world where power depends on dependence, that kind of knowledge is dangerous. The Egyptians saw the universe as a living network of words, each vibration carrying intention. To speak truth was to align yourself with Ma'at. To lie was to fracture the world. This was not magic as modern minds imagine it. It was language as creation, a science of harmony between the soul and the cosmos. Every spell was a reminder that divinity was not above but within. The Church, centuries later, would rename such practices heresy, calling them sorcery or blasphemy. But deep down, they recognized the reflection. Their own rites, their own chants, their own prayers echoed the same structure. Repetition, intention, sacred words. The difference was purpose. In Egypt, the initiate learned to command their spirit. In Rome, the believer learned to surrender it. The power of the name belonged to the priest, not the person. That transfer of authority changed the meaning of faith forever. Yet the older wisdom never truly vanished. Hidden in monasteries, whispered among scholars, the echoes of the true name survived. Even in modern prayers, the act of calling upon a higher power still carries that ancient memory. The belief that to name is to connect, to speak is to create, to know oneself is to be free. The Vatican could burn scrolls, destroy idols, and silence heretics, but it could not erase a truth older than its own scriptures. The Egyptians had already discovered the secret long ago. Power does not come from worshipping the divine. It comes from realizing you are part of it. When you walk into a cathedral and breathe in the thick scent of incense, you are breathing a ritual that was old long before the first church was ever built. The Egyptians burned the same smoke in their temples to carry prayers to the unseen. They walked in procession with torches, relics, and chants, facing the rising sun in the east, just as later Christian priests would. Every motion, every symbol, every note of sacred rhythm was designed to mirror the journey of the soul through light and shadow. But when those patterns appeared again centuries later in the rituals of the Vatican, they carried no mention of their origin. The resemblance was too precise to be coincidence. The vestments of the priests, the chalice of communion, the altar veiled in gold, even the act of ringing bells at dawn and dusk, all echoed the ancient liturgy of the Nile. Egypt had built a theatre of divinity, a living mirror between heaven and earth. In that mirror, the church later saw its own reflection and tried to claim it as revelation. Yet the original purpose was very different. Egyptian ritual was not about obedience, but remembrance. Every movement reenacted the story of rebirth, the rising of the soul like the sun each morning. The offerings were not bribes for mercy, but acts of harmony to keep the world in balance. When early Christians absorbed these practices, they changed their meaning. What was once a mirror of divine truth became a wall of sacred mystery. The church replaced understanding with awe, participation with submission. The incense still rose, but now it was meant to remind believers of sin rather than connection. The holy relics once symbolized continuity between the human and divine, but now they became trophies of faith, locked away and guarded. The sacred directions remained, but few remembered why churches faced east or why candles burned in threes. As centuries passed, these parallels became dangerous to notice. Scholars who pointed them out were silenced or accused of blasphemy. To admit that the structure of Christian worship came from Egypt was to admit that the roots of salvation were older than the Bible itself. That the rituals Rome called sacred were once the language of a different people, one that spoke of light without boundaries. The Vatican preferred to call it coincidence, or worse, pagan corruption. But history tells a quieter story. Across time, form survives even when meaning is rewritten. The mirror of ritual still reflects its first image, no matter how many new faces stand before it. The smoke that curls above the altar is the same smoke that once rose between the pillars of Karnak. The songs that echo in cathedrals still trace the rhythm of ancient hymns to Ra. The difference is not in what is done, but in why. In Egypt, the ritual made you part of the divine order. In the church, it made you dependent on it, and that subtle shift changed the course of faith forever. The journey of Egypt's forbidden wisdom did not end in the sand. It travelled quietly, carried by hands that never meant to start a revolution. Merchants from Alexandria brought goods to Rome, and along with them came fragments of old papyri wrapped in linen, used as packing material, as if the words meant nothing. Monks, who once sought solitude in the deserts near Thebes, carried copies of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, hidden inside bundles of scripture. They told themselves it was only for study, for comparison, but curiosity became devotion. Magi, philosophers, and travellers who had walked among the ruins of Luxor spoke in whispers about a sacred science that predated every gospel. By the time the scrolls reached the Tiber, Egypt's voice had already begun to echo in Latin. Pieces of its theology were scattered through private libraries, cited without source, disguised as moral allegory. A line about truth balancing the heart became a Christian parable. A hymn to the rising sun became a psalm of resurrection. The old gods had been renamed, but their wisdom still spoke beneath the disguise. Behind monastery walls, young scholars copied what they could not openly teach. In the margins of Bibles, they sketched symbols of Ma'at's feather and the solar boat. In secret lectures, they debated whether the soul's journey described in the Egyptian text was metaphor or revelation. Some called it dangerous, others called it divine. The Vatican, still forming its power, began to hear rumours of these hidden readings, a theology older than its own, surviving in scraps of papyrus and quiet fascination, could not be tolerated. But suppression could not stop fascination. The ideas moved faster than authority could trace them. From the Nile to the Tiber, knowledge slipped between worlds. A trader might sell a relic said to be from an Egyptian tomb, and along with it, a few lines of translated scripture. A priest might discover those same lines years later, in a sermon about truth and judgment, unaware of their origin. This was how the Egyptian spirit survived, not through open defiance, but through quiet inheritance. The church could control doctrine, but not curiosity. The human hunger to understand what lies beyond death crossed every border and every language. Even in the Vatican's own archives, copies of pagan texts sat beside the Gospels, studied and annotated by men sworn never to admit they read them. They wanted to know how a civilization so ancient could write so precisely about the soul. They wanted to know what Egypt had seen that they had not. The Nile and the Tiber were more than rivers. They were veins of memory, carrying light through time. And though Rome would try to claim ownership of truth, it was already too late. Egypt had flowed into its heart, and the current of that knowledge would never stop moving. In the quiet chambers of the Vatican, long before printing presses and public sermons, a different kind of work was being done. The Church had begun to build its vault of forbidden knowledge. Every text, every scroll, every fragment that did not fit into its doctrine was examined, labelled, and sealed away. When the Egyptian funerary writings appeared among the growing collections of translated works, the reaction was swift but subtle. The custodians of faith took note. They recognized in those papyri something both familiar and threatening. The words spoke of resurrection, of judgment, of eternal life, but not through Christ or the Church. These were sacred ideas without permission, truths that belonged to no one and everyone at once. That could not be allowed, and so they gave the texts new names: superstitio, paganum, sorceria. What had once been sacred became dangerous. The official record described the Egyptian writings as heathen fantasies, the magic of false gods. Yet behind the closed doors of the Vatican's scriptoria, scholars were told to study them in secret. The Church needed to understand what it feared. A quiet operation began to map what must never circulate. Lists were drawn of banned manuscripts. Notes were added to old inventories. Any text that spoke of power through knowledge, any scroll that taught salvation through understanding rather than obedience, was marked for containment. The Egyptian books topped that list. A few bishops argued that these writings were only history, harmless remnants of a dead culture, but others saw too much resemblance between the so-called spells of the dead and the prayers of the living. They saw the same symbols, the same rites, even the same structure of resurrection. To admit the connection would mean confessing that Christianity's foundations were not new, only renamed. So they buried the resemblance under silence. By the 4th century, orders were sent across monasteries to destroy or lock away any material referencing Egyptian cosmology. The public story became clear. Egypt was a land of idols and illusions. Its wisdom was corrupted, its people blind. But in the Vatican archives, the truth lingered in ink. Margins, filled with Latin translations of the Book of Coming Forth, by day, sat beside the Gospels they supposedly contradicted. The same men who called the texts heresy also copied them by candlelight, unwilling to lose what they secretly admired. The Church became both guardian and jailer of that ancient light. It was not ignorance that erased Egypt, it was strategy. Control of knowledge meant control of souls. By defining what was divine and what was forbidden, the Vatican wrote the rules of heaven and hell. Yet the papyri it condemned still whispered beneath the surface of its own doctrine. The custodians could not silence what they themselves had already absorbed. The more they tried to contain Egypt, the more it lived inside them. The first erasures did not happen with fire. They began with silence, a missing line here, a blank space there, a record quietly adjusted until history began to forget. Inside the early scriptoria of the church, scribes were given careful instructions. Copy every text that strengthens the faith, but if you find words that challenge it, skip them. If a passage questions divine authority, write around it. If an author mentions the gods of Egypt or their sacred writings, leave a space wide enough for absence to become normal. In time, those gaps turned into centuries of ignorance. Catalogue entries vanished overnight. Papyri that once sat side by side with the writings of Plato or Moses simply disappeared from inventories. When questioned, librarians answered that the scrolls had been damaged, lost, or misfiled. In truth, they were removed quietly, stored deeper in locked chambers, or destroyed before sunrise. The goal was not destruction alone, it was replacement. The church wanted history to tell a single story, one beginning and one truth, one path to salvation. Anything that hinted otherwise had to fade. And so, the Egyptian texts that spoke of personal judgment and self-redemption became ghosts in the margins. Monks continued to copy them in secret, using coded language to hide their presence. A verse about Ma'at became a note on divine justice. A line about the soul's journey through darkness was rewritten as an allegory of repentance. The meaning was buried, but the rhythm survived. Over the next 100 years, the Vatican perfected this art of omission. Censors no longer needed to burn entire libraries when a few careful edits could rewrite the past. By removing names, they erased connections. By removing context, they rewrote origins. Many ancient philosophers who once studied in Egypt were repainted as purely Greek, their teachers forgotten. The wisdom of the Nile became the wisdom of Europe, repackaged for safety. To the public, Egypt was reduced to ruins, its gods mocked as idols, its science dismissed as sorcery. Yet deep within the Vatican's vaults, the hidden copies remained. Dust gathered on shelves where forbidden words slept. Their absence echoed in every sermon that claimed the church had always been the sole keeper of truth. The scribes who followed these orders often wrestled with guilt. Some wrote confessions between lines of scripture, begging forgiveness for erasing what they believed to be divine. Others obeyed without question, believing they were preserving purity by cutting out corruption. Either way, the result was the same, a silence that grew so vast it became invisible. By the time the Renaissance dawned, whole generations had forgotten that a different map of the soul had ever existed. The first erasures were successful not because they destroyed knowledge, but because they made forgetting feel natural. History no longer needed to be burned, it only needed to be rewritten. As the old Egyptian vision of personal judgment faded into forbidden memory, a new system took its place. One carefully constructed by the Church to control not just life but what came after. The Vatican built an entire economy around death. No longer was the soul weighed by truth or measured by balance. It was now managed by priests who claimed to hold the keys to heaven. The confessional became the new scale, the priest the new gatekeeper. Forgiveness was no longer found within the heart, but granted from above, after payment, after ritual, after permission. The Church turned eternity into currency, a system of spiritual transactions that made the afterlife a matter of access rather than integrity. The sinner would confess, the priest would absolve, and the exchange was complete. But beneath that sacred surface lay strategy. The Egyptian idea that every soul could walk its own path to light had been dangerous because it required no institution. The Vatican solved that danger by creating dependence. Salvation was no longer self-guided. It required mediation, and with mediation came control. The introduction of indulgences turned this theology into business. Coins could shorten purgatory. Prayers could be purchased. Relics could cleanse sins. Every step closer to heaven came with a price tag. The invisible realm became a marketplace. The people, desperate to secure peace for themselves and their loved ones, obeyed. They traded faith for comfort, guilt for gold. The church's monopoly on death was complete, yet not everyone accepted it quietly. A few scholars, reading in secret, began to notice the similarities between the rituals of confession and the ancient Egyptian spells of purification. They saw how the weighing of the heart had been transformed into penance, how the prayers for the dead echoed the verses once meant to guide the soul through the underworld. The same structure remained, but the freedom was gone. What had once been a manual for self-discovery had become a tool for obedience. The church offered certainty, but only at the cost of independence. Fear replaced balance, and grace became a commodity. Still, the memory of the old way lingered. In hidden writings and whispered teachings, some dared to speak of a time when death was not owned, when the soul's journey was guided by knowledge, not debt. The Vatican worked hard to bury those whispers, but ideas have a way of surviving. Even as cathedrals rose and indulgent cellars filled the streets, the truth beneath it all remained unchanged. No man could sell what was already eternal. The monopoly on death was built on forgetting that. For centuries, it held strong, shaping empires and economies, but deep beneath the gilded altars and marble floors, the ancient idea still stirred like a spark under ash, waiting for a breath to wake it again. When the Egyptian words first reached the pens of Latin translators, something vital began to slip away. The language of the Nile was more than vocabulary. It was a living system of thought, every sound bound to spirit, every symbol carrying layers of meaning. But the men tasked with turning it into Latin did not see the world as the Egyptians did. They wanted order, not mystery, simplicity, not depth. And so, the sacred terms that once described the soul's many dimensions were flattened until their power drained away and their sources blurred. The word Ba, the aspect of the soul that could travel between the realms of the living and the dead, was reduced to a vague concept of breath or spirit. The Ka, the vital essence that gave form and identity, became merely the word for life. The Ah, the luminous self that emerged after death as pure consciousness, was translated as ghost. And Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, balance, and divine law, became justice, a word too small for what it once meant. Each translation was an erasure, disguised as understanding. To the Egyptian mind, these words described the architecture of existence. The soul was not one thing, but many, woven together like the strands of a net. When Latin scholars read the old papyri, they could not grasp this unity. They divided, categorized, and trimmed the concepts until they fit inside their theology. They took the living map of being and turned it into a static chart. What had been mystical became mechanical. What had been personal became institutional. The translators did not intend to destroy meaning, but their worldview could not hold what Egypt had seen. Their logic was built on separation, while Egypt had spoken of connection. As each term was smoothed and simplified, the ancient wisdom grew safer to handle. It no longer threatened to challenge the church's authority because it no longer spoke clearly. The subtle ideas of transformation, rebirth, and balance became harmless metaphors. Ma no longer governed the universe. She became a moral lesson. The Ba no longer roamed the stars. It became a poetic image of the soul's rest. And so, layer by layer, translation turned revelation into rhetoric. The Latin glosses spread across Europe, copied in monastic libraries, cited by theologians who never knew the original voice. The language of Egypt was forgotten, not because it was destroyed, but because it was diluted until it drowned in foreign words. Yet, something always remained. A trace in the rhythm, a shimmer between the lines, a whisper of what once was. Even mistranslated, the words refused to die completely. They waited, hidden in manuscripts, for a future that would read them again, not as symbols of superstition, but as fragments of a science the ancient world once mastered, the science of the soul. Long before saints filled the heavens, the Egyptians looked to the stars and saw their own reflection. The night sky was not a void to them, but a living scripture written in light. Each constellation was a story of birth, death, and return. The rising of Sirius marked the flood of the Nile and the renewal of life. Orion was not just a cluster of stars, but the body of Osiris reborn. The sky was a mirror of the soul, and to understand it was to understand the order of creation. But as the church rose and claimed dominion over heaven and earth, the stars were stripped of their voice. What had been science became superstition. The precise alignments that guided Egyptian temples, the sacred geometry that mapped the heavens to the human spirit, were rewritten as divine mysteries or dismissed as pagan magic. The same constellations that once told of cosmic order were renamed after saints and martyrs. The universe was repopulated with holy figures who performed miracles instead of embodying mechanisms. The celestial map became a gallery of human devotion, and the knowledge of how the heavens moved was folded into faith rather than inquiry. This transformation was not accidental. The church understood that control of the sky meant control of time, of calendars, of seasons, and of meaning itself. The Egyptians had measured eternity with precision, charting the movements of the sun and the stars to predict cycles of renewal. To them, astronomy was not rebellion against the divine, but participation in it. But when those same tools of measurement reached Rome, they were rewritten. Astrology became heresy, cosmology became metaphor. The knowledge of the stars had to be purified of its independence. What had once been a path to understanding was turned into a path to obedience. By the 6th century, the stories of the heavens were rewritten as miracles of saints. A star that once signalled the birth of a new age became the Star of Bethlehem. The movements of Venus, once sacred to Isis, became symbols of divine annunciation. The sky was still full of light, but it no longer spoke of laws and balance. It spoke of faith and submission. The priests replaced astronomers. The telescope would come centuries too late to reclaim what was lost. Yet, in art and architecture, traces of the old knowledge lingered. The domes of cathedrals mirrored the vault of Nut, the Egyptian sky goddess. The halos around saints' heads mimicked the solar discs of Ra. Even as the church buried Egypt's cosmic language, it could not help but copy it. Every saint that glowed in stained glass was once a star that guided travellers through the desert night. The miracle replaced the mechanism, but the shape remained. The heavens still told their truth, only now hidden beneath the names of men. While the church rewrote heaven, the desert kept its silence. Beneath the sand, whole libraries slept inside tombs, waiting for the world to remember how to listen. The Egyptians had built their graves not as prisons of death, but as engines of memory. Every wall, every coffin, every statue was carved with words that breathed. These were not decorations. They were instructions for eternity. The Book of Coming Forth by Day was not only written on papyrus, but engraved into the very stone of the afterlife. Each line spoke to the soul, guiding it past gates, guardians, and shadows. Every hieroglyph was a seed of sound, a vibration meant to awaken something eternal. While the Vatican erased and redacted, the Egyptians had sealed their wisdom into monuments that no decree could reach. Their tombs were vaults of language, each one a time capsule buried in lightless patience. Kings and commoners alike trusted the stone more than any priest, believing that truth carved deep enough could outlast corruption. The church had paper and power. Egypt had granite and stars. When later conquerors came and the old temples were stripped of gold, the carvings remained. They were too vast to steal, too sacred to destroy completely. Even when the Romans quarried their blocks to build cities, Fragments of the text survived, hidden in foundations and columns, the words of the dead holding up the living. Centuries passed, and the desert covered them again. Sand erased the cities that erased the temples, and silence became the guardian of truth. But silence is not death, it is waiting. The tombs still spoke, their voices trapped in stone, whispering through the cracks of time. When modern explorers rediscovered the Valley of the Kings and the necropolises of Saqqara and Abydos, the world realized that history had been listening all along. The walls were covered with verses that matched the forbidden manuscripts once buried by the church. Every chamber was a revelation, proving that the Egyptian understanding of the soul had never vanished. It had only been entombed. The carvings described in detail what theologians later claimed as their own inventions: judgment, resurrection, eternal life, all written thousands of years before Christ. To those who read them, it was as if the dead were speaking directly to the present, undoing centuries of silence in a single glance. Archaeology became a form of resurrection. Each discovery was not just a historical find, but a recovery of lost consciousness. The tombs had preserved what no archive could, reminding the world that truth cannot be erased, only buried. The church could burn scrolls and silence scholars, but it could never erase the words carved into eternity. The stones of Egypt, remembered. They waited beneath the desert sun, patient and unbroken, ready to tell the story of what the living had forgotten. In the early days of the Renaissance, when curiosity burned brighter than caution, a scholar named Matteo di Rossi uncovered what would become the most mysterious discovery of his life. In a dusty private collection belonging to a Roman nobleman, he found a papyrus unlike any other. It was a composite, fragments from several Egyptian funerary texts pieced together and pressed between thin panes of glass. The ink shimmered faintly under candlelight, black and red symbols winding across the page like veins of fire. Matteo recognized enough Greek and Coptic to know he was staring at something ancient beyond measure. The verses spoke of the journey of the soul through the stars, of the gates of judgment, of the heart weighed against truth. He saw echoes of the Gospels, but older, stranger, freer. He spent hours tracing the lines, whispering the words as if the sound itself carried meaning. The nobleman, amused by his excitement, granted him permission to study it for a week. Matteo copied as much as he could, but something about the text unsettled him. It seemed alive, as if reading it invited it to read him back. By the fourth night, he stopped sleeping. He wrote in his journal that the papyrus described not only the path of the dead, but the secret of divine sight, a method to remember one's true name even beyond death. Then, abruptly, his access was revoked. The nobleman's servants informed him that the church had requested the papyrus for examination. No reason was given. Within days, the artifact vanished. The collection's records were sealed under ecclesiastical authority. Matteo's copies were confiscated. Only his memory remained. He wrote frantic letters to friends across Florence and Venice, warning that he had seen something the Vatican did not want known. He spoke of a seal, a red wax emblem impressed on the nobleman's door after the removal, bearing the insignia of the Inquisition. Within a year, Matteo's letters stopped. Some said he was silenced, others that he fled north and lived under another name. Centuries later, one of his journals resurfaced in a Florentine archive. It contained sketches of hieroglyphs that scholars would not decipher until the 19th century. Everyone matched passages from the Book of Coming Forth by Day. The papyrus Matteo saw had been real, and its disappearance was no accident. It was part of the long chain of erasures that reached from the deserts of Egypt to the marble halls of Rome. The scholar and the seal became a legend among historians, a symbol of how fragile truth can be when it threatens power. The papyrus that once shimmered in candlelight was gone, but its reflection remained in the eyes of every seeker who dared to look beyond what was permitted to be seen. By the late Renaissance, the Church had learned that open suppression often drew more attention than silence. So a new strategy was born, elegant and invisible. Egypt, once condemned as pagan heresy, was to be rebranded. The directive came quietly, passed through clerical channels and academic circles under the seal of discretion. Egypt was to be admired, but only from a distance. It could be praised for its art, its architecture, its wisdom, but not consulted as a living teacher. Its texts were history, not instruction. Its symbols were curiosities, not revelations. The order did not need force, it only needed time. The language of dismissal hid itself beneath words of respect. Scholars were encouraged to study Egyptian culture as an intellectual pursuit, not a spiritual one. The papyri that once promised illumination were reduced to artifacts of superstition. The same verses that had once mapped the path of the soul were now described as primitive myths, charming but naive. Egypt was made safe for conversation but dangerous for belief. To admire was permitted, to practice was forbidden. This became the ritual of silence, a way to bury the power of truth without ever burning a single page. In the lecture halls of Europe, professors quoted fragments of the Book of Coming Forth by Day with scholarly detachment. They spoke of Ma'at as an idea of moral order, not a living force. They traced the line of Egyptian astronomy, but refused to see its connection to the soul's journey through the stars. Every layer of meaning was flattened into metaphor, every spiritual principle repackaged as poetry. The Church smiled upon this approach because it achieved what censorship could not. Egypt became a museum long before museums existed. The ancient words were encased behind the glass of interpretation. Even those who sensed the truth beneath the surface were hesitant to say so. The directive had done its work well. Egypt could now be studied by everyone and understood by no one. It was a triumph of control through admiration. The Vatican libraries continued to guard their hidden scrolls, and public scholars unknowingly repeated the same strategy. To call Egypt wise was fashionable, to call it alive was heresy. And so, centuries of silence were maintained not by force but by flattery. Egypt became the beautiful ruin, the noble ancestor of knowledge, but never its equal. The priests of Rome had learned from the pharaohs more than they admitted. They understood the power of ritual, and they turned silence itself into one. To this day, much of the ancient wisdom is spoken of as mystery rather than method, because once upon a time, someone decided it should only be remembered, never revived. The desert still holds the rest of the story, waiting for those who refuse to admire from afar. By the dawn of empire, Europe stood before its own judgment without realizing it. The scales of Ma'at had returned, not in temples or tombs, but in the conscience of civilization. As European powers spread across continents, they carried with them a story that justified their conquest. They called themselves the heirs of light, the bringers of faith, the architects of reason. But there was a flaw at the foundation of that story, a truth buried too deep for comfort. Egypt had come first. Its wisdom, its architecture, its understanding of the cosmos all predated what Europe claimed as its own inventions. To acknowledge that would have fractured the myth of Christian exclusivity, the belief that divine truth had entered the world only through the Church. So the old silence continued, not out of ignorance now, but out of necessity. The Vatican and its scholars could not allow the world to see that the civilization they called heathen had once mastered the sciences of spirit and matter, long before Europe awoke from its own dark ages. To admit Egyptian primacy was to admit that revelation was not confined to one faith or one people. It would mean that truth belonged to humanity, not to empire, and that was a dangerous idea. As explorers returned from Africa with tales of temples older than any Roman ruin, as scholars uncovered monuments aligned to the stars with impossible precision, the Church responded with quiet discredit. Egypt was called mystical, mysterious, enigmatic, words that sound admiring but mean unknowable. By turning knowledge into mystery, They made it safe again. Egypt could be ancient but never equal. It could inspire but never instruct. The weighing of empires had begun, and Europe feared the scale. In art and philosophy, however, the balance could not be hidden. Renaissance painters filled their cathedrals with eyes of Horus disguised as halos. Architects mirrored Egyptian symmetry in basilicas and palaces. Even the obelisks of Rome, standing tall in St. Peter's Square, carried the irony of stolen light. The empire that sought to erase Egypt had built its capital on its bones. The heart of Europe grew heavy with contradiction. It preached divine uniqueness while living inside borrowed geometry. It claimed creation while standing in imitation. In that quiet hypocrisy lay its greatest weakness. The feather of Ma'at had not disappeared. It waited, hovering above the world's conscience, testing the weight of every civilization that claimed to bring truth while hiding the one it took. In the end, it was not Egypt that needed vindication. It was Europe that needed forgiveness. The empire had inherited the world but forgotten the lesson of the scales. No power endures when built on imbalance. Truth, like the heart, must remain light. And the heavier the lie of dominance grew, the closer the scales came to tipping once more. If you stand in the nave of a Gothic cathedral and trace its lines upward, you will feel the same logic that built the pyramids. Stone rising toward heaven, light bending through sacred angles, pathways designed not just for feet but for souls. The builders of Europe never admitted it, but their blueprints carried whispers from Egypt. The geometry of the divine did not change. It only changed languages. In the floor labyrinths of Chartres and Amiens, pilgrims walked in circles, meant to represent the journey of the spirit toward salvation. Yet those spirals and turns mirrored the funerary paths carved in Egyptian tombs thousands of years before, guiding the soul through chambers of transformation. The pattern was the same because the purpose was the same, to remind the traveller that death was not an ending but a passage. But when questions arose about these similarities, the answers were always rerouted to mystery and miracle. The architects were called inspired by heaven, never influenced by history. The Church preferred divine spontaneity over human memory. If the geometry was sacred, it must be a miracle, not inheritance. The lines that matched the pyramid base, the angles that mirrored celestial alignments, the ratio of light to shadow that followed the golden measure, all of it was said to be coincidence or providence. The same story played out in stone after stone, each cathedral a coded echo of the desert temples. The very idea of sacred architecture was not born in Europe, but reborn there. Egypt had understood that numbers were prayers, that proportion was the language of eternity. When medieval masons rediscovered those truths, they wrapped them in Christian symbols, replacing solar discs with halos, lotus motifs with roses, and the path of Ra with the way of the cross. Yet the geometry remained loyal to its origins. The cathedral became the pyramid reborn, the house of stone reaching toward the sun once more. The irony was that the church stood inside Egyptian wisdom every day while denying it aloud. The faithful walked upon sacred mathematics without knowing where it came from. To keep power, the Vatican had to rename the ancient sciences as mysteries. What could not be owned was turned into miracle. What could not be explained without Egypt was left unexplained altogether. And so the architects who drew with compasses became servants of secrecy. They carved knowledge into plain sight, hiding truth within beauty. The pyramid and the cathedral became two ends of the same thought, joined by invisible lines across time. One was bathed in sunlight, the other in stained glass, but both spoke the same silent language of eternity. The world had forgotten that the divine can be measured, that faith can live in form. And as long as geometry stayed a mystery, the Church could claim it as miracle, never admitting that the pattern had been written first in the sands beside the Nile. If you stand in the nave of a Gothic cathedral and trace its lines upward, you will feel the same logic that built the pyramids. Stone rising toward heaven, light bending through sacred angles, pathways designed not just for feet but for souls. The builders of Europe never admitted it, but their blueprints carried whispers from Egypt. The geometry of the divine did not change, it only changed languages. In the floor labyrinths of Chartres and Amiens, pilgrims walked in circles, meant to represent the journey of the spirit toward salvation. Yet those spirals and turns mirrored the funerary paths carved in Egyptian tombs thousands of years before, guiding the soul through chambers of transformation. The pattern was the same because the purpose was the same, to remind the traveller that death was not an ending but a passage. But when questions arose about these similarities, the answers were always rerouted to mystery and miracle. The architects were called inspired by heaven, never influenced by history. The Church preferred divine spontaneity over human memory. If the geometry was sacred, it must be a miracle, not inheritance. The lines that matched the pyramid base, the angles that mirrored celestial alignments, the ratio of light to shadow that followed the golden measure, all of it was said to be coincidence or providence. The same story played out in stone after stone, each cathedral a coded echo of the desert temples. The very idea of sacred architecture was not born in Europe, but reborn there. Egypt had understood that numbers were prayers, that proportion was the language of eternity. When medieval masons rediscovered those truths, they wrapped them in Christian symbols, replacing solar discs with halos, lotus motifs with roses, and the path of Ra with the way of the cross. Yet the geometry remained loyal to its origins. The cathedral became the pyramid reborn, the house of stone reaching toward the sun once more. The irony was that the Church stood inside Egyptian wisdom every day while denying it aloud. The faithful walked upon sacred mathematics without knowing where it came from. To keep power, the Vatican had to rename the ancient sciences as mysteries. What could not be owned was turned into miracle. What could not be explained without Egypt was left unexplained altogether. And so the architects who drew with compasses became servants of secrecy. They carved knowledge into plain sight, hiding truth within beauty. The pyramid and the cathedral became two ends of the same thought, joined by invisible lines across time. One was bathed in sunlight, the other in stained glass, but both spoke the same silent language of eternity. The world had forgotten that the divine can be measured, that faith can live in form, and as long as geometry stayed a mystery, the Church could claim it as miracle, never admitting that the pattern had been written first in the sands beside the Nile. Hidden between the lines of Scripture lies another gospel, one not written for the masses, but whispered for those who could still hear the echo of something older. The early centuries of Christianity were filled with voices that did not survive the editor's blade. Among the rejected texts, the Apocrypha spoke of light within, of salvation through understanding, of judgment by truth rather than obedience. These were not ideas born in Galilee or Rome. They were reflections of a wisdom that had flowed for millennia along the Nile. The Gnostic writers, who wrote of the divine spark within man, were repeating, in new language, the old Egyptian belief that the soul carried a fragment of the eternal. The call to know oneself as a path to the divine echoed the same promise carved in the tombs of Thebes. Even the idea of resurrection as a personal awakening, rather than a single historical event traced back to the teachings of Osiris and Maat. But by the time the Church gathered its councils and fixed the canon, these resonances were declared dangerous. They gave too much power to the individual, too much light to the common soul. A gospel that said you could find divinity within made priests unnecessary. So the editors went to work, cutting, rewriting, and smoothing the jagged edges of Revelation until the connection to Egypt was invisible. The surviving scriptures were wrapped in the language of authority. The rest were buried in the sands of Nag Hammadi and the caves of Qumran. The line back to the Nile was erased in editorial ink. The Church replaced self-knowledge with dogma, inner judgment with confession, and illumination with faith. The same light remained, but but it was trapped behind stained glass, refracted into colours that only the clergy could interpret. Yet, even in the official Bible, traces of the old current survived. When Jesus spoke of the light within that cannot be hidden, when he said the truth would set you free, when he stood before Pilate and spoke of a kingdom not of this world, he was speaking the language of initiation, not institution. The Church tried to confine those meanings, but the human soul remembered. Across centuries, mystics, monks, and poets rediscovered fragments of that hidden gospel. They saw that the divine was not a throne in the sky, but a mirror in the heart. The Apocrypha were not mistakes or heresies. They were attempts to preserve what Egypt had already known, that truth is not given, it is recognized. The Vatican could erase the ink, but not the intuition. Somewhere beneath every cathedral, beneath every altar, beneath every sermon, the Nile still flows unseen. Its current runs through the forgotten pages, through the silenced Gospels, through the quiet knowledge that the light which saves does not descend from above, it awakens from within. The desert had been patient for a long time, but patience is not the same as silence. When the armies of Napoleon marched into Egypt at the turn of the 19th century, they brought not only soldiers, but scholars, artists, and engineers. Beneath the blazing sun, they began to uncover what the Church had tried for centuries to bury. Broken tombs and scattered papyri emerged from the sand like a voice returning from the dead. The Rosetta Stone gave the world its key, and for the first time in almost 2,000 years, the hieroglyphs began to speak again. What they said unsettled Europe. The texts did not sound like superstition. They spoke with a precision and sophistication that rivaled Scripture. They described creation as balance, death as transformation, the soul as eternal energy travelling through light. To the scholars who read them, it was clear that Egypt had not been primitive at all. It had been profound. When the Victorian explorers followed in Napoleon's wake, the trickle became a flood. Museums in London, Paris, and Berlin filled with sarcophagi, stelae, and scrolls. The fragments of the Book of Coming Forth by Day lay under glass, their symbols glowing under gaslight, telling truths that theology had long called myth. The public came to see the treasures, but few realized the danger they posed to the narrative that had shaped the Western world. Here were the original blueprints of resurrection and judgment, written thousands of years before the Gospels. The Church tried to remain polite, calling Egypt a civilization of shadows, a noble attempt at truth before revelation arrived. But the words on those papyri said otherwise. They spoke not of ignorance, but of mastery, of an understanding of the divine that required no intermediaries. The Vatican scholars visited these museums quietly, taking notes that would never be published. They could see the parallels too clearly. The Christian heaven looked like the Egyptian field of reeds. The angel who weighed souls looked suspiciously like Anubis. Even the concept of the Word made flesh had its echo in the Egyptian belief that speech and creation were one. The desert was answering back, and it was answering loudly. The myths of origin that had crowned Europe as the keeper of truth were beginning to crack. Archaeology, meant to glorify empire, had accidentally unearthed something that humbled it. The more that was translated, the more obvious the connection became. Egypt had not been a land of lost magic. It had been the first university of the soul. The sands had hidden its voice long enough to let power forget where it came from. Now, in glass cases and crowded galleries, that voice spoke again. The world was not ready to hear it, but the truth, once uncovered, could not be buried twice. The desert had kept its promise. It had waited until the right moment to remind humanity of what it had tried so hard to forget. When the language of Egypt was finally unlocked, it did not whisper. It spoke with startling clarity. The rediscovery of hieroglyphs turned the ancient world from myth into memory, and suddenly the voice of Ma'at could be heard again. Scholars who expected fables found philosophy. What they uncovered was not a book of spells, but a system of ethics, science, and psychology written in the language of eternity. The feather had returned, no longer just a symbol on a scale, but a key to understanding the oldest definition of truth. Egyptology began as an academic pursuit, but it quickly became something more. Translators found that the so-called magic texts read like moral blueprints. Ma'at was not superstition. She was principle. Her name meant harmony, truth, balance, and the integrity of action. The Egyptians had built their civilization on her law, a cosmic order where every choice, every word, every breath mattered. To live in alignment with Ma'at was to keep the universe in tune. That concept sounded strangely modern. Philosophers saw in it the roots of moral realism. Scientists recognized the seeds of systems theory. Psychologists found the first language for conscience. The ancients, once mocked as mystical dreamers, began to sound empirical, even clinical, in their approach to the soul. Their rituals were not about appeasing gods, but measuring inner order. The weighing of the heart, once dismissed as myth, now read like a moral equation. The heart's weight revealed the balance between truth and deceit, empathy and ego. The Egyptians treated the soul like something that could be cultivated, examined, improved. They believed that knowledge, not faith, illuminated the path to eternity. It was not theology. It was self-work. And that discovery changed everything. The Church had long claimed that salvation required divine mercy, that humans were helpless without grace. Yet here was a civilization that had written, thousands of years earlier, that the soul could ascend through its own honesty. As Egyptology advanced through the 20th century, Ma'at's vocabulary began to re-enter human thought. Words like balance, integrity, and cosmic order resurfaced not as theology, but as ethics, psychology, and science. Modern scholars marveled at how precisely the Egyptians described the relationship between moral behavior and natural law. They spoke of the universe as alive, bound together by consciousness and consequence. To them, truth was not a belief, it was a force. The feather of Ma'at had become more than a relic. It was a reminder that ancient wisdom could meet modern reason and find no contradiction. For every fragment recovered, for every translation completed, Egypt seemed less like a vanished world and more like a mirror. The ancients had not been primitive, they had been precise. They had measured the soul with the same care we now measure the stars. The feather had returned to the scale, and for the first time in centuries, humanity began to weigh itself again. When the language of Egypt was finally unlocked, it did not whisper. It spoke with startling clarity. The rediscovery of hieroglyphs turned the ancient world from myth into memory, and suddenly the voice of Ma'at could be heard again. Scholars who expected fables found philosophy. What they uncovered was not a book of spells, but a system of ethics, science, and psychology written in the language of eternity. The feather had returned, no longer just a symbol on a scale, but a key to understanding the oldest definition of truth. Egyptology began as an academic pursuit, but it quickly became something more. Translators found that the so-called magic texts read like moral blueprints. Ma'at was not superstition, she was principle. Her name meant harmony, truth, balance, and the integrity of action. The Egyptians had built their civilization on her law, a cosmic order where every choice, every word, every breath mattered. To live in alignment with Ma'at was to keep the universe in tune. That concept sounded strangely modern. Philosophers saw in it the roots of moral realism. Scientists recognized the seeds of systems theory. Psychologists found the first language for conscience. The ancients, once mocked as mystical dreamers, began to sound empirical, even clinical, in their approach to the soul. Their rituals were not about appeasing gods, but measuring inner order. The weighing of the heart, once dismissed as myth, now read like a moral equation. The heart's weight revealed the balance between truth and deceit, empathy and ego. The Egyptians treated the soul like something that could be cultivated, examined, improved. They believed that knowledge, not faith, illuminated the path to eternity. It was not theology, it was self-work, and that discovery changed everything. The Church had long claimed that salvation required divine mercy, that humans were helpless without grace. Yet here was a civilization that had written, thousands of years earlier, that the soul could ascend through its own honesty. As Egyptology advanced through the 20th century, Ma'at's vocabulary began to re-enter human thought. Words like balance, integrity, and cosmic order resurfaced not as theology, but as ethics, psychology, and science. Modern scholars marveled at how precisely the Egyptians described the relationship between moral behavior and natural law. They spoke of the universe as alive, bound together by consciousness and consequence. To them, truth was not a belief, it was a force. The feather of Ma'at had become more than a relic. It was a reminder that ancient wisdom could meet modern reason and find no contradiction. For every fragment recovered, for every translation completed, Egypt seemed less like a vanished world and more like a mirror. The ancients had not been primitive, they had been precise. They had measured the soul with the same care we now measure the stars. The feather had returned to the scale, and for the first time in centuries, humanity began to weigh itself again. When the translations began to circulate and the connections became undeniable, a quiet panic took hold among the keepers of history. The question was simple but devastating. If the prayers, the symbols, and even the calendar of Christianity mirrored Egyptian patterns, then who had truly written the blueprint of Western salvation? The dates of Easter matched the solar cycles long tracked along the Nile. The cross resembled the Ankh, the symbol of eternal life. The resurrection mirrored the story of Osiris, reborn through the love of Isis. Even the language of light conquering darkness traced back to Egyptian hymns for Ra at dawn. Each discovery chipped away at the illusion of divine exclusivity. The Church had called Egypt the cradle of idolatry, yet its own rituals seemed to drink from that same source. Scholars, historians, and theologians argued furiously. Some claimed coincidence, others whispered continuity. But behind the debates was fear. If the foundation of faith was built on older stones, then the authority of its builders might crumble. The panic of provenance spread through universities and seminaries alike. Every similarity became a threat, every shared symbol a scandal. The Vatican responded with silence, neither denying nor confirming. Museums published carefully worded catalogues, praising Egyptian artistry while avoiding the implications of influence. Publicly, the Church congratulated itself on its openness to study. Privately, its curators watched the evidence grow impossible to contain. The scholars of the 19th century had not set out to challenge theology. They only wanted to understand history. But history, once opened, refuses to close. When papyri described the weighing of the heart beside the Gospel's final judgment, when tomb inscriptions spoke of rebirth in light and truth, the line between Egypt and the Bible blurred. The question could no longer be ignored. Was revelation a single event, or a long inheritance written in many tongues? For centuries the West had told itself that civilization was born in Greece and redeemed in Rome. Now the map was changing. The Nile, not the Tiber, seemed to be the true beginning. The implications were enormous. If salvation's symbols were Egyptian, then the idea of Europe as the center of divine history collapsed. The monopoly on heaven was gone. What had been borrowed without acknowledgement now stood in plain view. The panic was not just theological, it was existential. To admit Egypt's authorship was to admit that the oldest wisdom belonged to a people the West had long called other. And that realization struck deeper than any heresy. The Church had tried to erase the Nile, but its waters had risen again, flooding the foundations of empire with inconvenient memory. In the end, the question of provenance became a mirror. It asked not who owned truth, but who feared it. And as that question spread, the silence that once protected power began to sound more like confession. The name the world gave it was wrong. The Egyptians never called it the Book of the Dead. They called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, the Book of the Living. It was not written for corpses or coffins, but for consciousness itself. Every verse was a reminder that eternity begins with awareness, not after death, but during life. It taught that living rightly was the only preparation for dying well, to walk through the world with a balanced heart, to speak truth, to act with integrity, to honor the divine in all things. These were not prayers to distant gods, but instructions for being human. The text was not about escaping judgment, but about living in such a way that judgment became unnecessary. Each line read like a mirror for the soul. Have I spoken lies? Have I caused harm? Have I taken more than I have given? The reader was invited to weigh their heart daily, to live in accordance with Ma'at, the order that held the universe together. It was philosophy disguised as ritual, science disguised as myth, and that is what made it dangerous. The Book of the Living required no priest, no confession, no external authority. It gave the individual power to measure their own worth, to correct their own path, to seek alignment without permission. It turned morality into practice, not obedience. When later religions promised salvation through intercession, this ancient manual whispered that salvation was self-earned, that divinity was not above but within. That message could overturn empires. The Vatican could tolerate Egypt as myth, but not as method. If people believed they could live rightly through awareness and truth, they would no longer need institutions to define goodness for them. They would no longer fear death as punishment or reward. They would see it as transition. The Church could not compete with that kind of freedom, so the Book of the Living became the Book of the Dead. The words were rebranded, the meaning inverted. What was a guide for the present became a curiosity for the past. But now, as translations reveal its real intent, the text feels strangely modern. Its wisdom aligns with psychology, with ethics, even with physics. Balance, awareness, cause and effect, these are universal laws, not superstitions. The Egyptians wrote them in poetry because poetry lasts longer than rules. To live by, Ma'at is to live awake. To live awake is to create harmony wherever you walk. The Book of the Living was never meant to be hidden in tombs. It was meant to be memorized in hearts. That was its true immortality. The soul that knows itself does not need saving, it needs remembering. And that is why, after thousands of years of being buried and renamed, the book still breathes. It refuses to die, because it was never about death at all. It was about becoming fully alive. In the end, all the stories return to the heart. The libraries of the world can burn, the shelves can be sealed, the names rewritten, but the truth that once lived in Egypt was never meant to stay in ink. It was meant to live inside people. The Book of the Living, the Feather of Ma'at, the Judgment of the Soul, these are not ancient relics. They are reflections of what every human already carries. The Vatican could hide manuscripts, could rename gods, could reshape memory into dogma, but it could not unwrite the conscience. The heart is the final archive, the only one that never loses its place. And when the world grows loud with lies and power speaks louder than truth, that is when the scales return. The myth of control fades because conscience cannot be conquered. The Egyptians knew this long before Europe crowned itself the guardian of heaven. They knew that justice begins not in courts or cathedrals, but in the balance between intention and action. The scale is not some supernatural instrument. It is the inner measure that weighs truth against deceit every day. It is the quiet knowledge that everything we say, think, or do leaves a mark on the order of things. Ma'at was never about punishment, she was about alignment. When the heart grows heavy with dishonesty or greed, it drifts away from harmony. When it lightens through compassion and truth, it rises. That rising is salvation. Not a throne, not a promise, just balance restored. As the modern world rediscovers fragments of the past, it begins to see how little we have changed. We still search for meaning, still fear judgment, still hope to be remembered as good. Yet the Egyptians left a message that removes the fear. You are your own judge. The universe does not demand worship, it asks for balance. Every civilization that forgets that truth collapses under its own weight. Every empire that claims ownership of divinity ends up weighed and found wanting. The Vatican tried to erase the Book of the Dead because it revealed too much. It showed that the kingdom of heaven was never for sale, that no ritual could replace integrity. But history has its own resurrection. Knowledge buried in sand rises again in time. Institutions can hide shelves, not stars. They can erase catalogues, not conscience. The papyri may crumble, the temples may fall, but the wisdom they carried still moves through the world like breath through dust. In the end, the feather waits for everyone. It does not ask what we believed, only how we lived. The verdict is not spoken by priests or angels. It is felt in the weight of the heart. And when that final measure comes, the only question that matters is the oldest one ever written in stone. Was it light enough to rise with the Sunday,